In this lesson, we will import multiple files into the Access database that we had created earlier to create tables, which will be used to carry out further activities in the database. To import a file, we need to click on the External Data option in the main menu. In the submenu that appears, you will see a number of icons which are grouped into two categories, the first one being Import and Link, and the next one being Export. The files that we can import data from are of different types. For example, it could be a text file, it could be an Excel document, it could be a table in Access, or it could be some other format which you could find in the More option in this group. But from the Cambridge exam point of view, only two are relevant at the moment, which are text and Excel. Out of these two, the format used by Cambridge in the exams for this course has always been text. The Excel option is slightly different in the steps that are offered, but is a simple process as well. The file or files that are provided by Cambridge for this activity have almost always been CSV files. CSV files are actually text files aimed at a different arrangement of data for processing. Where typical text files contain flowing text, as is found in word processing documents, a CSV file contains data that is meant to be processed as a table of values. Therefore, you will notice that in a CSV file there are commas between values, which are meant to help the program being used to identify as to which column the value should be imported in. CSV files, when viewed in a file manager, would have the Excel logo, identifying the associated application, because of which when you double-click on the file, it opens up in Excel, but it is still actually a plain text file. If you look at the icons in the two groups on the menu, you will notice that there are many options that are similar between the two groups. Therefore, you need to be careful when selecting the type of file to ensure that you are choosing it from the correct group. Sometimes students accidentally choose the text option from the export menu, as a result of which, when they select the file to use for importing data, the file is overwritten by Access with a blank file of that name. The students then start panicking as to why the import option is not working, and if they somehow realize that they had chosen the option from the wrong group, when they choose it from the import group the next time, the file appears blank, which results in further panic because the student is unable to understand at that point why neither of the text options from either group worked. So what you will need to do in this case is to copy the original file back into your work folder before trying the import process again. Let us proceed with the import option now. Click on the text icon in the import group. This will open a dialog box which will have a path displayed in a text box and a browse button on its right that you need to click on to locate the file for importing the data. So I'm going to click on the browse button, and on doing so, another dialog box opens, through which I can choose my folder and the file to import. I'm going to scroll down to the drive that contains the file that I need to import. This is the file that I'm importing. As you can see, it has a .csv as the extension written at the end. Okay, now, an important thing about the extension is that mostly on the computers using Windows, you will not be able to see the file extensions. The extension is used to identify the file type, which is used by operating systems to decide which program the file should be opened with. Windows, by default, uses a more descriptive format for identifying the file type, as you can see over here. Initially, the file extension, which is usually a 3-character abbreviation written after a dot at the end of the file name, was used to identify the file type. But Windows introduced the descriptive format and later it disabled the displaying of the extension, though it is still part of the file name. We can choose to enable the option to display the extension, as it makes it easier to choose the correct file during the exam, especially when multiple files with the same name are provided in an exam and the paper uses the extension to tell you which file to use for the task at hand. Now that I have selected the file to import, I will click on the button labeled Open to use that file. This will bring me back to the previous screen where the text box contents would have been replaced with the name of the chosen file along with its path, as you can see in front of you. Before proceeding further, I want to point out a mistake that is sometimes made by students. You can see that there are two radio button options on this screen. The first one says import the source data into a new table in the current database. And the second one says link to the data source by creating a linked table. By default, the first option is selected. If you select the second option by mistake, you will not be able to carry out many of the later activities in the database. So with the default option selected, we click on the OK button to go to the next screen. Here we again have two radio buttons and a box at the bottom, which shows the contents of the files that we had selected in the previous screen in the original form. The options given at the top identify the format of the file so that it could be processed accordingly. The first option, which is selected by default, refers to a format in which commas or tab spaces are used to separate values for different columns. The second option refers to a format in which all the values for a particular column would be taking up the same amount of space, though the width or length of all the columns might not be the same. As you can see in the box below, the values are obviously separated by commas, so we will again leave the default option selected and click on the next button to move to the next screen. In this screen, the first row of options is asking us to provide further detail about the character that has been used to separate the values for the different columns, since the option delimited selected in the previous screen referred to characters separating field values. Again, in this case, the correct option has been selected by access by default. As you can see in the box below, that the values in the file have been successfully split into separate columns. If I were to change the delimiter character option to something else, such as the tab or semicolon, you would notice that the values are no longer split into separate columns, since there are no tabs or semicolons in the data, obviously. If I choose the space character option, it will show the values split into columns because there are obviously spaces in between the values. But you will notice that this division into columns does not make much sense. For example, if you look at the value of the first column, you have a number followed by a comma followed by a word. Does that make any sense? Well, obviously no. So let us select the default option again. Now you will notice that the values in the different columns make more sense. For instance, the values in the first column just contain numbers now, except for the value in the first row, which I will be explaining next. We now move to the next item on the screen, which is a checkbox with the description "First row contains field names." So if you have a table in which there are different values in the different columns, you would need some sort of a label for each column to identify as to what kind of values are there in each column. And that is what this option is referring to. Now, if you look at the data in the box below, you will notice that the first row of data appears to be different from the other rows. For example, the text in the first row of the first column reads "code," with numerical values listed underneath. The next column reads type of product to be sold with values such as lever-awk file repeated underneath it. If this does not seem that obvious to you, then let us look at the fourth column, which has the text quantity of items in each pack in the first row and some numbers underneath it. So this shows obviously that the first row contains the labels, which in database terms refer to field names. Therefore, we will click on the checkbox to select this option, and you will notice that the first row values appear to have become fixed to their current position. What Access will do now is that for creating the table, it will treat the first row values as column headings and the values in the remaining rows as data, which we will see in the next screen. So, we will click on the next button to move to the next screen. This screen is important as the choices made here decide whether you would be getting the marks reserved for choosing the correct data types or not. What exactly are data types? When we enter data into the computer, we need to tell the computer as to what kind of an item are we providing to the computer, so that it can accordingly make space available for storing the value and would be able to perform operations on the items accordingly. If you were to enter two different items, such as the marks for a student in a test and the date of the test, the computer would store the values differently. So it will need to be informed in advance about the types of the two values, since it cannot do so itself, unlike the humans can. I will not be explaining the technical details of this concept here, since I want to keep the video short and focused on the actual activity. Let's click on the drop-down in front of the data type field over here to see what sort of data types are available in Access for us to choose from. When we click on the drop-down, a pop-up appears which displays a list of different data types supported by Access. Let's look at them one by one. The first one that we have over here is yes/no, which in technical terms is referred to as a Boolean value. A Boolean value allows only two types of values to be accepted, either yes or no, which can also be represented as true or false. So if you wanted to store the status of something, like for example, if a student was still studying in the school, so you could actually store that as a status as yes or no to identify that, rather than actually writing a descriptive format or descriptive value to represent that. The next data type is byte. Now, I'll explain the three next types together because they are similar. Byte, integer, long integer, all three of these represent whole number values. The reason why we have three types of whole number value data types is the amount of space that they actually require to store the value. Because when we are storing data in the computer, one of the things that we need to consider is the amount of space that is taken up by a value. Even though the computer can store a lot of data in a very small device called the hard disk, we still do not waste space, because otherwise we'll run short of space very soon for storing further data. Byte, which is the first type, can store values within the range 0 to 255. So if you wanted to store a positive value for a particular field that can have a minimum value of 0 and would not exceed the maximum value of 255, then in that case you should be choosing byte. For example, if you were to store the quantity of items that are kept by a store in the inventory, then you can actually choose that, unless their quantities do exceed 255, in which case we'd have to go for the next type. The next one is integer. Integer is also a whole number data type, but unlike byte, it can store much larger values. And along with that, it also supports negative values as well. So if I were to talk about the range of values that it can store the smallest negative value up to minus 32,768 and the largest positive value to 32,767, which is quite a large range of values. The next one after that is long integer. The range of values that are supported by long integer is a much larger range as compared to integer. Like an integer, it can store both negative and positive values, but its maximum range goes into billions. So technically we are supposed to choose the data type from these three for integer values based on the type of values that would be stored in a particular field. But as far as the examination for IGCSE, ICT is concerned, the examiner does not actually differentiate in the marks or like give any special credit for a type being chosen from these three based on the type of values that are to be stored in a field. So long integer is usually chosen by default. That's fine for our exam. The next one after that is currency. Currency, as it's obvious from the name, is used to store values which are currency values, like the price of some item. Then we have single and double. These two are related as well because they are both used for storing values which have a decimal point in them. The difference between the two is the number of digits that they support after the decimal point. Again, in this particular case, if we were asked in the exam to store the value as a decimal point value with, let's say, 1, 2, or 3 digits after the decimal point, single would be good enough, but we normally choose double because, again, the examiner would not give us any special credit for choosing single. The next one after that is date with time. Again, obviously, it is used to store values that represent the date of some sort. Like I mentioned earlier, the date of the test for a particular student, so we would choose date for that. The next one after that, the last one that is relevant for now, is short text. Short text is actually used to store values which are alphanumeric in nature. Like, for example, the name of a student, the address of a person, or the title of a book, the title of a movie, or anything of that sort. Now, when we have to assign the values, when we have to assign the data types, we can take a look at the values that are in front of us and accordingly choose the correct one. So if you look at the first field, which is code, you will notice that the values over here are whole numbers, obviously. So the data type should be integer, like byte integer, long integer, one of those. But like I said before, choosing long integer is absolutely fine with the examiner, and they don't give us any special credit for choosing byte or integer based on the type of value that would be stored. In this case, integer would be okay. That would be the better choice. But we would keep long integer as the default option suggested by Access. When you click on the next one, you would notice that the type has changed automatically, and as well as the field name based on the column that I clicked on. And as you can see over here, this is just a sequence of characters. It's the name of an item. So short text has been suggested by Access, and that's absolutely fine. If you go to the next field, this is the description of the product to be sold, and this is also short text as suggested by Access, so we will leave the default one selected in this case. When we go on to the next one, which is quantity of items, you will notice that these are whole number values and long integer has been suggested, so this is absolutely fine. For color, it has suggested short text, so that is fine too. Moving on to the next one. Sales price. Now double has been suggested for this one by Access. But if you look at the field name, you would notice that it says sales price. So since it's a currency value, so the more appropriate choice would be to select currency over here. Clicking on the next one again shows the same behavior by access, it has suggested double. So we will choose currency. And the last one over here is discount. Now, underneath discount, you would see we have values like Y and N. Sometimes in the examination, the examiner has stored these values or has the values written as yes and no, or true and false, or -1 and 0. So it would vary from file to file. But they're all Boolean data types. So for these, we would have to choose yes, no. Now this is something that Access does not always give a correct suggestion for. As you can see over here, it says short text, when it should have actually been yes, no. So we will click yes, no over here, and we have, and the work is completed. Now, I use this method of selection so you can actually see the data while selecting the data types. But in the examination, the format that we normally use, the method that we normally use is to click on the Advanced button, which gives us a list of all the different fields and their data types, so we can choose them more conveniently rather than having to switch from one field to another and scrolling left or right continuously. Also, because in the examination, the examiner mostly has the details written in the paper about what the type of data should be for a particular field. So we just need to change it from over here based on the field that it's written against. Let me increase the size of this so we can actually see the value that's written in the first column, because the values are a little long, so they're partly hidden. Okay. The next thing that we need to consider over here is the name of the fields. The names of the fields have to be sensible, they have to be concise. They can't be very long like they've done over here. And they need to follow a particular standard. Now, usually in the O-level examination, IGCSE, ICT examination, the examiner already has the field names provided in the standardized format. But if in case the examiner provides you something of this sort, then in that case, you would be expected to change the field names to sensible names. Most probably the examiner would have suggested those in the paper, but if not, then we would have to look at the descriptions ourselves and come up with sensible representations or identification for those fields. The first one is code, so that's fine. That's a short, concise term that is being used to represent the code. The next one is type of product to be sold. So I'm going to change this to a shorter format and I'll write product type. The next one, it says description of product to be sold. So I'll just replace it with description. Let me just delete the rest rather than actually writing the whole thing again. The next one after that is quantity of items in each pack. So I'll just write it as pack quantity. And the one after that is color, so that's fine. Sales price, purchase price, discount, the rest of them are all fine. Since we've already selected the data types through the previous screen, we don't have to do that again over here. Now I'm going to click on OK. And then I'm going to click on the next button to move to the next screen. Now over here, the last step that we need to do is to choose the primary key. Again, this is something that is suggested by the examiner in the examination. But if not, then in that case, we have to take a look at the data that we've been provided with and see if there is a field, a column that contains unique values. A good identification of that would be the word code or ID in the name of the field. Now here we see ID and we see code as well. But this ID is not actually part of the file, as you would have seen from the previous screens that we had actually gone through. It's being displayed by Access because the first option that's selected by default by Access is let Access add primary key. So since we want to choose it ourselves, we usually never choose this for as far as the exam is concerned. So since we want to choose it ourselves, we normally would choose this. And if we do not want to choose it, then we say no primary key. Now, if I click on choose my own primary key, you would notice that the ID field that was visible over here has suddenly disappeared. So coming back to making the choice ourselves, since this field name is code, which obviously means the identification code of the product. So I'm going to choose this one over here, which I don't actually have to do because Access has done that itself by default. So I'm going to leave the default one selected. But if Access has not selected it correctly, then in that case, we can click on the drop down and choose it from over here. Now we click on the next button, and this is the last screen, which we normally don't have to do anything in it, unless the examiner specifically has mentioned that in the paper, that you have to name the file using a specific term or phrase. Otherwise, we simply just click on Finish, and that completes the import process. Now, if we have followed all the steps properly without any mistakes, then in that case, you will see a message such as this one, that it finished importing the file such and such to, and the table name after that. Otherwise, it would display a message over here which would say something of the sort that there were some errors in importing the file. So when you click on close, if there were some errors, you would actually see two files instead of one. The second file would normally have some sort of a name such as import errors to identify as to what kind of errors were encountered in importing the file. The import process does not end over here. There is one other activity that we need to usually carry out on the table that has just been created so that we can complete the requirement for the task given in the examination. For that purpose, we have to right-click on the file that has just been imported and click on Design View in the pop-up that appears. This will open the table in Design View mode, where we would be able to see the field names and their data types. Now, the things that we need to change, that we might be required to change, would be items such as the number of digits after the decimal point. For example, in the sales price, the value had decimal point. The decimal had a decimal in the had a decimal point in the actual value stored in that column. So in the exam, they would have mentioned that it should have 2 decimal places. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, you would notice a set of properties displayed. The property that we need to change for this purpose is decimal places. We click on this and we click on the drop down that appears and we choose 2 from over here. The next thing that we are normally required to change is the display format for the Boolean values, which in this case is the discount field. And the examiner normally expects us to display the values as either yes or no, or true or false. Now, you might think that we've already chosen yes, no, then why do we need to do anything further? Actually, the thing is that when we choose yes, no as the data type for a particular field, Access stores the values as -1 and 0. -1 for yes and 0 for no. So if we wanted to display the values either as yes, no, or true, false, or something else, we would have to do one more step. And that is to click on the format property, and from the drop down we choose yes, no. Now, when we view the contents of the table, the values would be displayed as yes, no. So I'm going to click on the view button over here. It's going to prompt me to save the changes that I have made in the table. So I'm going to click on yes. And when I look at the file, I would be able to see the sales price with 2 decimal place values. Though like it didn't actually make much of a difference because this is predefined as the property for the currency data type. But if it were not the currency data type, then we would have seen the difference. And for discount, where we had the values y and n stored in the original file, you can see that the values are now being stored as yes, no. So this completes our activity. The next step is to create relationships. A relationship is basically a link between two tables, which is established to create associations between related rows of data between the two tables. Since we only have a single table at the moment, we cannot create any relationships. Therefore, let me import another table so that we can create a relationship between the two. In the exam paper, you are given instructions on importing the first table, which also includes information about the data types to set for the different fields. But no information of the sort is provided for the second table that you are asked to import. So based on the explanations that I had given you earlier in this video, you would have to choose appropriate field types. Please remember to choose the correct data types, otherwise the data that is entered in Access will not be stored and processed correctly, and the results produced will obviously be not as per requirement. Let me open the next file to import. I will first close the current file before starting with the import of the next file. Then as we did previously, I'm going to click on external data and then text file from the important link group, and then go to the folder where the file is stored. And this is the file that I'm importing. Click on open. Okay, now, unlike the previous case, we now have 3 radio button options over here instead of 2. But like I said before, you have to leave the default one selected. The new option that has been added in this case is not applicable at the moment as far as your course is concerned, so I'm not going to go into the details of this one. Let's just continue with the import of the current file. I'm going to click on OK. Leave the default option selected like we did before. Click on Next. And comma is the delimiter that has been selected by Access. The data has been split into different columns correctly. The first row is very obviously the labels. So we click on this. Remember to always select this option, otherwise you will face errors in the import process because this data is a different type as compared to this one. This is text and this is numbers. So it will give you errors in the import process, and the field names will not be assigned properly because you would not have chosen the first row as the field names. So you will be running into a few problems if you skip this step. So remember to choose this option. Now we click on Next. Now for choosing the data types, this one, these are whole numbers, so obviously long integer is fine. The next one, Access has just suggested short text, and we can see that we have alphabet along with a number in the value that has been entered. So this is alphanumeric data, and the data type for that is short text, so we'll leave that as it is. Product code, these are whole numbers, so obviously long integer is fine. Units, these are also whole numbers, so long integer is fine. We click on Next, and then for the primary key, first of all, let me just click on this one because this has been added, so we don't want that. To click on this, and now from the remaining fields, we can see that the order number values are not unique. The customer number is not unique either. Units are obviously not unique. The product code, this appears to be unique or so. No, this is not unique either, because if you look at this value, 16603, it's repeated over here. So you have to be careful about that. This means that there are no fields in this table which contain unique values. So we will click on no primary key in this particular case, and then click on Next. The last one, the last screen basically is asking you to confirm the table name. So we will leave the default one selected by Access, and we click on Finish to finish the import process. And it says finish importing the file, which means it was successful. We click on Close. And this is our new file. We open it and see The contents appear to be fine. There's nothing wrong with them. So this means that the file has been imported successfully. Now we close this and we move towards the process of creation of a relationship. Now for creating the relationship, we have to click on the menu item database tools. In this menu, one of the options given is relationships. We click on that and a dialog box pops up which displays the names of the tables that are present in our database, which we had imported earlier. So we'll have to select both of them, but I can't do them like this. So either I hold down the shift button and click on the second one after, click on stationery, I'm going to click on this one while holding the shift button, or I can actually do this, drag with the mouse and have both of them selected. Then click once on the add button. Remember to click only once. And you can see that both the tables have been added in this window. Now we click on close. Now, to create a relationship, an important thing that you should remember is that the relationship can only be formed on the same field in two tables. But if we look at this, you would notice that code does not exist in this one. Product type, description, pack quantity, color, sales price, purchase price, discount, none of these fields exist in this one. So what do we do in that case? So this is a special case which you should keep in mind. Mostly when we are expected to import tables, we would have one field that would be common between the tables that we need to create relationships. But sometimes what the examiner does is, even in practical scenarios, we don't exactly have the same name. So then we have to take a look at the data to see which fields contain similar values. So I'm just going to open the tables for you so that you can get an idea. I'm going to open the stationery table first. Okay? These are the contents of the code table, the code field. And I'm going to click on orders, and these are the contents of the different fields. Now, there is one field in this table which has code mentioned in it. This one has a field which, the complete name for which is code, whereas this one has a field which is the name product code for the field rather than simply code. So we will compare the values in these two and see if there is any similarity. The value in this one, the first one is 3447. If I go to this one, 3447 is there. Look at another value, 10280. Let's see, 10280. So this means that it is the same field, right? So we can create a relationship between these two. So I'm going to close these two tables one by one. It's asking me if I want to save changes. The reason why it's asking me that is because I had changed this the width of this column, so that's why it's asking me if the changes need to be saved. It doesn't matter if we save it or not because this is not that important. So I'm just going to click on no. Now we're back to the relationship design window. Now to create the relationship, what I need to do is to drag the field from this table and drop it on the field in the other table with which I want to create the relationship between the two tables. Now, the process is simple. We simply just drag and drop like this. And a dialog box opens up which shows us the details. For example, over here it says stationery, the table name and the field. And over here it says orders, which is the table name, and product code, which is the field. Now, one thing over here that you should know, that if, for example, for some reason you were not able to control the mouse in a way that would result in the correct field getting selected in the other table, then you don't have to worry. You don't have to cancel and do it again. You can always choose it from over here like this. You can select and choose it from over here, right? Because sometimes it does happen, like you're not able to actually control the mouse for some reason. Maybe the mouse is faulty or something of the sort, or maybe you're a little tense during the exam. So whatever the case might be, don't worry. It can be done this way. It's an easy solution. Okay. Now, one more thing that we have to do over here is to click on the Enforce Referential Integrity checkbox, this one. This is important, but in some cases, Access does not allow you to do that. So when you click on Create, it will give you an error message, in which case you can uncheck this and click on Create. Otherwise, usually we have to click on this option before clicking on the create button. When we do that, you will notice that a line appears between the two tables, which shows the link between the two fields that we had selected. And on the line, we have one written over here, and this is the infinity sign over here. This is a one-to-many relationship, which means that each value in this table will be associated with multiple values in this table. What does that mean? Let's take a look at that again. I'm going to open the stationery table. You'd see that 3447, which we saw earlier, appears once over here. If I open this one, 3447 appears once over here. That's fine. But if I look at another value, look, 16603, it appears twice over here. And if I go to the stationery table, 16603, it appears only once over here. So this means that for this item, there are two orders. In database terms, we would say that each row in this can be associated with one or more rows in this. We won't say 2 or 3, we would say 1 or more, because it will actually be associated with a minimum of 1. Actually, it could be a minimum of 0 as well, because like not all products have orders associated with them. So we can say 0 or more. So either they are going to be 0 entries in the other table, or they will be multiple entries in the other table, right? So it could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 3, it could be 4, or any number. So that's called a one-to-many relationship. So we'll close this. And there's one more thing I'm going to tell you before we complete this video. When we have to create the relationship, we drag one field from the first table and drop it on the other table. The order matters. You would notice that one of the fields has a key symbol against it. This is because I made this field a primary key field when I had imported this table. So we always drag the primary key and drop it off on the field in the other table. We don't take this field and drop it off on the primary key because that sometimes causes problems. So keep that in mind when you're creating relationships. That completes this video.